Over 65 years on the throne, yet hers is a reign that nearly didn't happen.
I think for Princess Elizabeth, the abdication must have been catastrophic.
Driven by duty,
My whole life shall be devoted to your service.
she's ruled over crisis and war
Our thoughts today are with those in the South Atlantic.
and dramatic social and technological change.
Television has made it possible for many of you to see me in your homes on Christmas Day.
She's seen over 12 prime ministers come and go.
The Queen has a very sharp mind.
She's endured the breakup of the empire and the creation of her beloved Commonwealth.
The Queen had an instinct
Of what the new Commonwealth was about.
Throughout it all, she's been a steadying presence. Yet the most famous woman in the world remains mysterious. This is the inside story, as told by her closest friends and advisors.
I think the Queen is basically a very shy person.
She's very humble, actually.
She's a wonderful mimic. I mean, she's really, really funny.
It's hard to imagine a world without her.
She has done her job bloody well.
Elizabeth, the wife, the mother, the Queen. The 90s had been a very difficult decade for the Queen. She dealt with a very public backlash after the breakup of her children's marriages.
It has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
And following the death of Diana, public opinion was at an all-time low. The Queen was seen as out of touch, traditional and too formal. As the 21st century beckoned, the monarchy needed once again to rethink the way it related to its people. Tony Blair had swept to power in 1997.
We ran for office as New Labour, we will govern as New Labour.
He was the Queen's 10th Prime Minister, her youngest to date, and perhaps her most modern. And he was all too aware of the importance of her role as our monarch.
The Queen regards the monarchy as a huge responsibility, and all of her life has been trying to live out this sense of duty and obligation and to make sure that the monarchy remains still relevant to people. I found her ultimately very knowledgeable about issues and with this ability to kind of sense where public opinion was in a way that would have put to shame many politicians.
Alistair Campbell was Tony Blair's Director of Communications at the end of the 90s and has written about the Queen.
One of the people I interviewed, one of her circle, talked about how important it is to her that she is held in affection by the country. And that's not just because she wants to be popular. He said the opposite of affection is disaffection. And if you have a public disaffected with the monarchy, you have no monarchy.
The new century was a chance for the Queen to rebuild bridges and reconnect with her public. And Tony Blair wanted to help the monarchy do just that. To celebrate the arrival of this century, New Labour built the Millennium Dome and planned a huge New Year's Eve celebration to be televised to millions of viewers. Tony Blair wanted the Queen to be guest of honour and join her people at this significant time.
It was obviously a very big moment in history. Yeah, and it was important that she was out there on that evening, I think.
The idea was that the Queen and the nation would be entertained by breathtaking acts from all over Britain.
There's this wonderful performance that was going on 60 feet above our heads. I had this terrible vision of these people somehow falling from the top of the dome and crushing the royal family, and thinking that this would not be a great headline for the world.
The Millennium celebrations included a spectacular fireworks display. But inside the dome, Blair's plan was turning into a night the Queen would rather forget. News editor Stuart Purvis was a guest at the dome.
You have to remember that the Millennium Night celebration at Greenwich was not a royal production. It was almost a political production, really. And it showed. It was really, really a bad event. I suspect the Queen thought, this isn't one of my shows, if you like. And she was really not comfortable with the whole thing.
As Big Ben struck midnight, the whole dome broke into Auld Lang Syne.
This was all a bit weird. Suddenly, it was a kind of family occasion. And what do you do? Well, of course, probably Tony Blair and Cherie, like in our household, they shake out, they do all this. Well, Scottish households, grand Scottish households, they don't do that because the ladies don't want to get all their diamonds and things cluttered up with that, so you hold hands like this. So the Queen and Prince Philip were doing it their way. Tony and Cherie were probably thinking, well, how do we do it? And so everyone is feeling a little bit awkward.
Her discomfort was palpable to the millions who watched the celebrations on TV.
I think Tony was just a little bit conscious of the fact that he's bringing the new millennium with the Queen, and that's never been done before. So, do you grab her hands and make them cross over? And said, no, I don't think it'd been rehearsed.
Well, the whole razzmatazz thing, I don't know. It's sort of, it wasn't as you normally see her. To me, it seemed to be, you know, watching. I thought, well, they're putting her in a rather funny situation. But she has to react. She has to cope with it.
In a rare public display of affection, Prince Philip was seen kissing the Queen.
He was just caught, I think, just for a minute, just giving her a kiss, which one felt at the time, here, you know, I'm here, it's all right. He was reassuring her that he could get through that situation.
I thought the Queen was a bit uncomfortable, and I felt really sorry for her, but I mean, frankly, I was a bit uncomfortable. The whole event was very odd, and the whole night passed in a bit of a blur, frankly. But anyway, she put up with it in extremely, you know, good spirits, considering.
The event had put the Queen in an undignified position. Her attempts to reconnect and seem less traditional hadn't had the best of starts. At the turn of the century, the Queen was battling negative public feeling. The events at the Millennium Dome had done little to restore her popularity. And it wasn't just a problem at home. Abroad, her unpopularity had been building for some time. In Australia, there were plans to remove her as Queen. Critics speculated that if it could happen down under, then one day it could happen in the UK. In the 1990s, Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating had proposed a republic.
It would be the intention that as a result of this committee's deliberations and the public discussion that would follow, the Australian people would be in a position to decide by referendum later in the decade whether Australia should become a republic by the year 2001.
Though there's a lot of affection for the Queen in this country still, the country's outlook and aspirations can never be represented by a non-Australian. When I met the Queen in Balmoral, she said, of course, I will always take the advice of Australian ministers and the Australian people. And I said, ma'am, we'd expect no less and ask for no more.
As well as Australia, the Queen was the head of 16 different nations across the globe, from Canada to Jamaica, New Zealand to Papua New Guinea. If Australia became a republic, more countries could follow suit. But despite the high stakes, she was careful not to get involved in the public debate.
There was an affection there. After all, Prince Charles had been to Geelong Grammar School for a term or so. I think it would be disappointing to the Queen. But on the other hand, she had really accepted that it was the decision for the Australian people to make.
In 1996, Keating was replaced as Prime Minister by John Howard, a politician with monarchist sympathies. But the referendum would still go ahead as planned.
I honestly do not believe Australia would be a better country if we abandoned the present constitutional system. It's part of our history. And unless there's a good reason, you don't break links with your history. But even more important than that, it works.
On the 6th of November 1999, Australia went to the polls. As the Queen nervously waited for the result, it looked like her 48-year rule of Australia was about to end.
Well, the Queen was intensely interested in the outcome. I knew that whatever the outcome would be, she would wish Australia well and retain an interest and affection in it.
When the ballots were counted, the results were a surprise to many. All 6 states had voted to keep the Queen.
The country had an appointment with history, and it failed the appointment.
Coincidentally, the Australian rugby team were in the UK, competing in the World Rugby Cup final in Cardiff. The Queen was there to present the trophy to the winner.
I'm told she was very pleased, but by the person who officially conveyed the result.
What we didn't know is that the Australians would come to the UK and win the Rugby World Cup, which added a certain piquancy to it, including the Queen presenting the trophy to John Eales, the Australian captain, just after the result of the referendum. As they say in Fleet Street, you couldn't have made that up.
The Queen's presence at the Rugby World Cup final was a symbolic moment. For many Australians, it was cause for a double celebration. The Queen had held her own in the country she regarded with fondness. But closer to home, family worries were about to test her in a far more personal way. The Queen's sister, Princess Margaret, had been ill for some time. In 2002, her health took a turn for the worse. Princess Margaret had always been the Queen's glamorous and mischievous sister, and they were devoted to each other.
She was the companion of her childhood, and she was younger than the Queen, and they did talk a lot, more or less every day. So she was a very, very constant presence in her life.
Growing up, the Queen's family had been a tight-knit unit. They called themselves Us Four. After the death of their father, 2 sisters became even closer. And they'd had other difficult times. In the 50s, the Queen had not been able to support her sister's relationship with divorcee Group Captain Peter Townsend. But despite this tension, they had remained close. Lady Glenconner was one of Princess Margaret's best friends and a maid of honor at the coronation.
Princess Margaret adored the Queen and was always very loyal. I mean, she always talked and was very proud of what the Queen had done and all that.
During the breakup of Princess Margaret's marriage to Anthony Armstrong-Jones, the Queen had been a great support.
The children used to go and stay with her a lot, and she sort of did her best to make it better for Princess Margaret, I think.
In February 2002, Princess Margaret died from her 3rd and final stroke. The Queen had lost her only sister.
Well, I would imagine she was expecting it, because she had Princess Margaret been ill for a very long time. We're all devoted to her. She was so good to everybody, and I think a lot of people wept a lot.
In a way, it was sad, but I was so glad that Princess Margaret, who'd suffered so much at the end, and for somebody like that who had been so vivacious and beautiful and enjoying life, to see her in a wheelchair, unable to see, it broke my heart, actually.
Princess Margaret's funeral was a relatively low-key affair for a member of the royal family. For the Queen, it was a doubly sad occasion. Princess Margaret's funeral fell on a very painful anniversary. 50 years ago to the day, they had buried her father in the same chapel at Windsor.
When Princess Margaret died and the Queen Mother was still at Sandringham, where she would have probably stayed, but she insisted on coming down to Windsor and taking part in the funeral.
A fragile Queen Mother didn't want to be seen by the press.
We all sat in front, all the ladies in waiting, together, and it was terribly poignant because the Queen Mother was a wheelchair, and when the coffin went by, she tried to stand up. I think she may have been helped up so that she could be standing when Princess Margaret's coffin went. Princess Margaret was cremated, one of the first members of the royal family, I think, because she wanted to be buried between her parents, and there was any room, really, for ashes.
In the weeks after Princess Margaret's death, the Queen Mother's health continued to deteriorate.
The Queen obviously had been worried about the Queen Mother for some time because the Queen Mother was an enormous age and was appearing in public very regularly. The Queen would obviously be worried that she was going to fall over or something, which luckily she never did.
I think the Queen Mother had been ill for some time, and she had some trouble with her lungs, I think, and constant coughing and that sort of thing. But it was all kept fairly low-key, you know, they didn't talk about it much. And she was, after all, in her 102nd year, I think. Wonderful.
The Queen Mother had been the Queen's rock throughout her 50-year reign.
I think hardly a day went by without communication between them, either visit or telephone call. And when the Queen was overseas, she wrote a series of letters every day back to her mother.
I mean, the Queen Mother had a lot of adulation from the public, and people loved her. The Queen Mother was a very strong person. I think she's got a lot of her mother's qualities in her, the Queen.
Just 6 weeks after Princess Margaret's death, on the 30th of March, the 101-year-old Queen Mother passed away.
The Queen Mother, mysteriously and miraculously, waited until the one day in the year when she could have died without any inconvenience to anybody. She waited until the Queen was at Windsor, with all her family around her. The Queen was out riding and was just summoned to Royal Lodge, and as I understand it, the Queen Mother had her head perfectly all right until about 10 minutes before she died, when she just sort of basically spun away.
The two women who had been closest to the Queen throughout her 50-year reign were now gone.
She'd lost her mother, who was not only a friend and companion, but her mother, somebody she spoke to every day on the telephone, that she would visit regularly, that she knew and loved, and was the link also with her father, you know, a key figure in the Queen's life.
The Queen Mother's would be the first royal public funeral at Westminster Abbey since Princess Diana's in 1997.
There was speculation in the newspapers that people wouldn't turn up, that, you know, the Queen Mother, being over 100 years old, belonged to another generation, that people wouldn't remember her. In fact, people turned up in their hundreds of thousands. I mean, the country was mourning.
Sir Michael Wilcox was the Queen's black rod at the time. He was her daily representative in Parliament and responsible for many ceremonial duties. After the Queen Mother's death, he organised for the coffin to be brought to Westminster Hall, where the public would come to pay their respects.
Initially, when she died, and at the first meeting, coordinating meeting at Buckingham Palace, there was a sense that we should only open the lying in state for a limited period during the day. And I argued against that. I felt that the nation would turn out for the Queen, both in sympathy and to show their affection. We opened on the first morning, and within 3 hours, we had a 3-mile queue. And I then said, OK, we'll keep it open 24 hours a day. It was overwhelming, and the queue went right the way out down the other side of the Thames. There were all kinds of people. There were young children, young mothers, young families, and the older generation. So you name it, and they were in that queue.
Over 1 million people came to mourn the Queen Mother.
It is the fairy tale Queen Mother, the mother of our sovereign. For much older people, she was the Queen during the Second World War. She represented their lifetime story. There is an outpouring of emotion that is about oneself, one's country, exemplified in the life of the person who has died.
One hesitates to compare it to the emotion over Diana, but it was a mass popular moment of emotion when perhaps the cycle after the death of Diana swung decisively in the monarchy's favour.
She's had a great life. Diana only had a short life, but she's done so much for history, she's gone through so much, and she just really puts the backbone back into Britain.
She was a wonderful lady. We love him very much, and he do a lot of good for we.
As the Queen left Westminster Hall, the crowd reacted in a surprising way. It would be a transformative moment as the public now began to support the Queen.
There was this very polite, very discreet clapping, which was almost symbolising the transference of affection from one great matriarch to another. And I know that the Queen was very touched by that.
On the eve of the funeral, the Queen addressed the nation.
Ever since my beloved mother died over a week ago, I have been deeply moved by the outpouring of affection which has accompanied her death. But the extent of the tribute that huge numbers of you have paid my mother in the last few days has been overwhelming. I thank you for the support you are giving me and my family as we come to terms with her death and the void she has left in our midst.
Well, it must have changed her life enormously to lose her mother and her sister within a few months of each other like that. It must have been very traumatic for her, very sad.
I think she missed them a lot. I mean, suddenly she lost her two best friends, really.
After the service at Westminster Abbey, the Queen Mother's coffin was taken to Windsor Castle, its final resting place, alongside her husband and daughter, Princess Margaret.
I think with the death of the Queen Mother, there was a subtle change in the role of the Queen. Now, the Queen was the oldest member of the family. She was the matriarch. She, as it were, was moving into the Queen Victoria role. She was the senior member of world royalty. And some people say that that almost freed her, that she seemed to relax a bit.
Well, Martin Charteris, who I think was her best private secretary, always used to say, wait and see what happens when the Queen Mother dies. Because I think with any parent, somehow they're always looking over your shoulder. And suddenly, she did blossom. There's no question about it.
These deaths would herald a new era in the Queen. At the turn of the century, the Queen had lost two of the most important people in her life. Her sister, Princess Margaret, and the Queen Mother. Despite the public sympathy for the Queen, the sovereign still had a problem with her image. She needed a new way to connect to her people and show that she was in touch. She and her senior advisors had created a working party to develop a new strategy. They called it the Way Ahead Group. It was chaired by the Queen herself.
The Queen was central to the Way Ahead Group, but actually not just the Queen. Every single member of the inner royal family came to the Way Ahead Group and their private secretaries.
The meetings were sometimes a bit chaotic. I recall that the Queen had a bit of a tendency to chat to whoever was sitting next to her rather than paying full attention to the proceedings. The Duke of Edinburgh had to sort of call people to order from time to time.
One of the issues the group looked at was the itinerary for the Queen's public engagements. The Way Ahead Group suggested that she made her visits edgier and more inclusive.
We needed to look at the way the royal programme was made up and modernise it a bit and make sure that the monarchy reflected society more accurately. I mean, there were lots of visits around the home counties because of the proximity of Windsor and Buckingham Palace. Should there be a greater geographical spread, making sure that, different parts of the country saw all this happening.
When she visited industry, she tended to go to factories when actually the way the economy had moved was that there were far more service companies. For instance, in the entertainment sector, it's easier to get a little bit stuck in your ways. This was a deliberate attempt to just nudge things forward a bit.
The Queen is very pragmatic. She's willing to look at the pros and cons of an argument and then go for something that's the modern way of doing things. That's another feature of her character.
2002 would be the Queen's Golden Jubilee year, marking 50 years on the throne. But had the Queen done enough to reach out to her people? Had the Way Ahead Group's planning been successful?
I remember the Silver Jubilee of 1977, and what a huge event it was, how exciting it was, the street parties. And then as we came up to the Golden Jubilee, 25 years later, 50 years of Elizabeth II on the throne, I sensed, oh goodness, it's not going to be as big an event. Somehow this last decade has been too troubled for the royal family. It's going to be a bit muted. And I think there was apprehension within Buckingham Palace as well.
Critics questioned whether the general public would organise any events at all to celebrate 50 years on the throne. In 2001, the palace website included a snooker tournament and a tree planting as some of the few events being planned. The Guardian ran with the headline, "Palace plays down fear of Jubilee flop." The palace asked Lord Stirling, who had organised the Silver Jubilee, whether he could once again put together a programme of celebrations. But even he had his reservations.
I said that I need about 48 hours to find out as to whether or not there will be the appetite, because so much had happened as to whether people even wanted to celebrate.
Lord Stirling called his friends in big business to try and secure funding.
And the responses I got was, we'd get support of about close to £3 million.
He now needed to get the public on side.
I remember asking Murdoch and crowd how they would feel about supporting it, and Rupert in particular was hugely supportive of the Queen, etc.
Rupert Murdoch's newspapers began to get behind the Golden Jubilee. The Sun tried to encourage its readers with the headline, "Have a bash for Her Madge."
It would not have been sensible to have spent a lot of time saying, this is going to be the greatest event in British history. I think one of the great insights was, don't set expectations too high, and that would have come from the Queen herself, who doesn't like a fuss.
The Queen's Golden Jubilee celebrations kicked off with a nationwide tour. But would the public turn out to greet her?
Some were fearful that the Queen might turn up and there wouldn't be a particularly warm welcome. Or would there be a welcome at all beyond the mayor turning up and the civic dignitaries? In fact, it was a huge success. I was privileged to be part of the tour, to go on some of these visits. And the Queen was moved, was touched to find that so many people turned up, cheering, waving their flags. And from people being apprehensive about it, it turned into a huge triumph.
She said, "What's this?" And I said that it was a picture and I drew it for her, and she said thank you. I thought she was going to be quite nice, and she was.
The Golden Jubilee was a great opportunity to put further into practice some of the initiatives that had been trialled in the previous year. So I think that was a really good year. And people were genuinely surprised that the Queen was out and about in the way that she was, visiting inner cities, disadvantaged people, showing Britain for better and also the areas that needed to have light shone on it.
In her Golden Jubilee year, the Queen also visited the industrial town of Scunthorpe and her first British mosque. To engage with the Muslim community in this way was one of the most mould-breaking decisions she'd ever made, and one of the most inclusive.
The idea came after 9/11, when the terrorist attack on Twin Towers. And I said to them that I need to send a letter to Her Majesty the Queen to invite her. We got a top-class mosque in London and all this area, and she decided to not go there, but decided to come in small, tiny town, North Lincolnshire, which was great.
9/11 just happened. There was a lot of anxiety amongst the Muslim community, on both sides actually, and it was a great gesture from Her Majesty the Queen to come to the mosque at that time to show that doesn't matter what happened, nobody can divide us, and we are one nation and one people. And I personally really appreciate that.
She took the shoes off and she came into the mosque. We were all lined up, everybody, to meet her.
We were all anxious and not really prepared, but when we met Her Majesty, it was like meeting someone that we knew from our childhood. She was such a nice, down-to-earth person.
Queen takes a huge interest in people when she meets them. I mean, she doesn't just shake hands and turn away. She really wants to talk to them and to know what they're doing and what their interests are.
She was very interested in the history of Islam, especially the Mecca, because we had all the pictures here, you see, and she was asking about that. And I was lucky enough to give her a Quran myself, which she accepted, and I think is still somewhere kept in a safe place, maybe in Buckingham Palace, I don't know. And she might read it.
She is queen for all of us, and it is fantastic that we made the history. The rest of my life and other people's life, it will stay with us.
You know, what she did was really, she won the heart of millions of Muslims.
At the start of the century, the Queen had been unpopular and out of touch. In her Golden Jubilee year, she showed that she was prepared to evolve as she met different kinds of people and went to new places.
Change has become a constant. Managing it has become an expanding discipline. The way we embrace it defines our future.
Her Jubilee Parade in June 2002 was the ultimate example of this relaunch. This was a new, more inclusive kind of monarchy. 20,000 people marched down the Mall, including firemen, circus performers, Bollywood dancers, and even Hell's Angels.
How far have you come to be here today?
How far is Australia? 10,000 miles?
Oh, well, I'm a true royalist. I just think it's wonderful.
The whole world seemed to have come out to celebrate with her. As the highlight of the celebrations, the Jubilee organisers planned 2 huge concerts at Buckingham Palace, one classical, one pop. 3 years earlier, the Queen had been the guest of honour for the New Year's Eve celebrations at the Millennium Dome, which had left her feeling uncomfortable. The Jubilee concerts were her opportunity to show the world that she could be less traditional, less stiff, and more in tune with her people. It was the first time that the palace had allowed such an event to take place in its grounds.
I had the pleasure of an audience with the Queen to bring her up to date as what was transpiring, and it was in her private office with one of the great bay windows at the back of the palace. And then I mentioned about the various events, and in particular, the concerts were going to take place at the palace. And she said, oh, yes, and you must come. And come. So we went, and she took me over to the window. And of course, outside, they've got all the bulldozers and scaffolding and goodness knows what else. And she said, look what they're doing to my garden.
It wasn't just the great and the good that were invited. The general public would get a chance to attend the party at the palace. 2 million people entered the ballot for golden tickets.
Having these major events in the palace itself, I think, was a brilliant idea, as it sort of brought people into it as against having the mystique.
The pop party at the palace lasted for 3 hours. The concert's iconic moment would be Brian May from Queen on the top of Buckingham Palace. The Queen had heard her national anthem many times, but not quite like this.
I think, British people are always up for a party, and I think perhaps most importantly, that actually, given the opportunity to say thank you to their sovereign, the British people will take that opportunity and they will say thank you, and that's what I think was symbolised in those events.
The Queen didn't expect much of the Golden Jubilee, but perhaps with the Golden Jubilee, we see the beginning of a more self-confident monarch emerging. It's her millennium. It's her turning of the clock and moving into a new, very relaxed, very happy age.
The Golden Jubilee had put the Queen back on top, but there was still a problem that she needed to resolve. At the classical concert, a few rows back from Prince Charles, was his longtime mistress, Camilla Parker Bowles. This was her first public appearance in the presence of the Queen. For the Queen to truly put the difficulties of the past decade behind her, Camilla's status in the royal family needed to be dealt with once and for all. It became clear that Prince Charles's relationship with divorcee Camilla Parker Bowles needed to be sorted out. Camilla's presence tarnished the Queen's public image.
Divorce from the early years has been the bugbear of the Queen's reign, from the abdication through Margaret and then up to Charles and Diana. It manifested itself still as an issue when it came to the remarriage of these two divorced persons, Charles and Camilla. But there was this extra dimension that Camilla was perceived, rightly or wrongly, as the reason for the breakup of the marriage and the tragedy of Diana.
By the time of the Jubilee, Camilla was living with the prince at Highgrove.
He had always made it absolutely clear that she was a non-negotiable part of his life. So you have a situation where the Prince of Wales is basically, if I can put it like this, living with his mistress. And that's not very satisfactory, because one day he becomes head of the Church of England. She was a divorcee. He had also been divorced, but his first wife was dead.
In an attempt to introduce a more positive image of Camilla, Prince Charles ran a carefully planned public relations campaign. The Camilla problem needed to be settled before his succession to the throne.
If he was going to marry her, it had to happen during the Queen's reign, and so a very well orchestrated campaign set up, which took about 2 or 3 years, at the end of which they were able to marry.
On the 9th of April 2005, Charles and Camilla married in Windsor Registry Office. But there was one key person who could not attend.
The Queen clearly believes in being the defender of the faith, and people also forget she is the supreme governor of the Church of England. So there are certain things that she will not do because of the kind of authority God has given her.
The Queen could not possibly be seen to countenance the remarriage of two divorced persons. So it was quite simple. They had to go down to a registry office in town, in Windsor, and get that side of things done, the public side, with her not involved.
But it doesn't mean she will be unloving. So she would really recuse herself from those areas which, in fact, she says to herself, I am the supreme governor, but Charles is my son. A service where God's blessing and forgiveness is being asked for, I'll be there.
The Queen did attend the blessing and hosted their reception at Windsor Castle. Sir Nicholas Soames was one of the wedding guests.
It was a wonderful day, a huge gathering in St. George's Hall. And the Queen was very, very much on parade. And she made the most charming speech.
It was a special day for the Queen in more than one ways, in that it was the day of the Grand National. Brass tapped. Voice says, the Queen has an announcement to make, an important announcement. And the Queen stands there and says, yes, exciting news, everyone. Hedgehunter has won the Grand National. She used it as a metaphor and talked about Charles and Camilla and said how they'd survived Beecher's Brook, how they'd survived the chair and all the other obstacles. And they had come home and dry and won the race. And she said, welcome to the winner's enclosure. And to liken the struggle that they'd been through to the Grand National from the Queen really was the sign of approval.
She was absolutely charming, and there was a great roar of approval. I mean, a great roar after she'd done it. It was a great day. No, absolutely. Gosh, I mean, what a time it has been.
The marriage seemed to draw a line under the Queen's troubles. In 2006, as she approached 80, the monarch moved into a new phase.
I do think the press in particular didn't see the royal family institution, the monarchy, as being a source of stories in the way that they had previously, and that made a difference. I think the country were getting used to a new generation of the royal family, and I think the fact the young princes were emerging made a huge difference. I think people began to see the Queen also not just as a mother, but as a grandmother.
As the decade ended, her grandchildren began to take a more visible role in royal life.
They obviously love her, and I'm sure she loves them too. And I'm sure they go to her for advice, because they couldn't have a better person to ask.
I think if you asked Prince William and Prince Harry if they'd learned anything from the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, they would say a great deal. I know that's the case because I've heard them talk about their grandparents in terms of respect, affection, but also seeing how they do things. And if you like the style of Prince William and Prince Harry, it's because they've learnt a lot from past masters at the game.
As the Queen headed towards the end of the decade, she had a new confidence.
I think the Queen is basically a very shy person. I've seen her stepping out of the royal train and having to gear herself up to face the crowds many times. When that challenge is overlaid with public criticism, as there was, for instance, at the time of Princess Diana's death, I think it's very hard to bear. So if instead what you're reading in the newspapers and seeing on television is broadly supportive and warm towards you, you relax in turn. And that is what's happened to some degree for the Queen.
Finally, she came into her own and became in many ways a different woman, clearly at ease with herself, but she is clearly totally at ease enjoying her job, and the country is enjoying her doing it and wants her to go on doing it as long as jolly well possible.
She had seen personal loss with the deaths of her mother and sister. She had seen her son and heir, Prince Charles, remarry, and she had proved her relevance to the British people. At the end of the decade, her popularity had never been so high. The world now saw a more self-assured monarch, the nation's grandmother.
You know, she's demonstrated through all this change the human side. She recognized that you have to be more out there with the people in today's world. But you never forget with her that she's the Queen. And that ability to retain the aura at the same time as move with the new age, that's really what marks her out, I think.
Next time, as the Queen heads towards her Diamond Jubilee, there will be weddings to celebrate and a new generation of royals. But there will also be difficult territories to navigate on her first trip to Ireland.
The security for Her Majesty the Queen's visit was huge. We knew that there would have been people who would not have wished her well.
And the Queen will become Britain's longest reigning monarch.